All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy and post-Kantian thought. And today, you're all in for a very, very, very important treat. Today, I have Dr. Peter Lamb here to discuss Karl Marx. So, Dr. Peter Lamb is now retired, was an associate professor of politics and international relations at Staffordshire University in the UK. He is the author of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, a reader's guide from Bloomsbury Academic in 2015. The First Marx, a philosophical introduction, co-written with Douglas Burnham, Bloomsbury Academic in 2018. Socialism, Key Concepts in the Political Theory. Recently, Harold Laski, The Reluctant Marxist, Palgrave Macmillan 2024. And I do believe you also have an edition on socialism that just came out in 2024. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a historical dictionary of socialism. Yes, it's the fourth edition. I've been doing that over the years, and the fourth edition came out this year. Yeah, yeah, the
And
historical dictionary. That's with Roman and Littlefield.
great. And also many other books, papers on Marxism, and socialism. So I am super happy to have you here, Dr. Lamb. Thank you so much
Okay.
for being here and being a participant in this series.
Right, I'm glad to be here. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
If you could introduce us to who Karl Marx was, and in your opinion, what do you think makes his thought important for us in the contemporary world?
Okay, well, he's probably we could say one of the greats of political philosophy. Um, there's political thinkers over the years who've said something really new. And so you go from Plato, Aristotle, people like Hobbes, Machiavelli, Rousseau, Hegel, uh, Locke, John Stuart Mill, Bentham, and Marx, certainly fits into that category as one of the great political thinkers. He's a great social thinker as well, and social and economic thinker. There have been socialist thinkers before him, obviously, but I mean, socialism is essentially a movement that began in the 19th century, early 19th century. It's got obviously it drew on ideas from many centuries before that socialism did, but it really emerged as a growing important, political philosophy in its own right in the 19th century. Now, Marx, he's not the first socialist by any means, but he's probably the one who present it in a solidly theoretical framework, and he did it, and he became so influential for that reason. There's a solid methodology there. There's a version of socialism in a way that's not been that hadn't been done in that much detail and that much method beforehand. It wasn't to every socialist's liking his view of socialism and communism. I mean, well, early in his career, he began to distinguish between the two, but later on, he used the term socialism as well. But anyone in the left movement, if you like, either agreed with him, or if they didn't agree with him, well, they've got to say why, really, because he put such a forceful argument forward. And for that reason, I think he influences so many people on the left, whether it's communism or whether you want to call it the left wing of socialism as well, that he is the giant of socialist, communist, socialist left wing theory. Um, Obviously, communism is clear on the left of that. Socialism comes between the middle and the right end of the spectrum, which is by no means right wing, even if it's the right wing categories. But anyway, socialists who want to produce a theory really ought to say why they don't agree with Marx. That's fine if they say that, that's fine. But he's such an influential figure. His ideas have been adopted, and the name Marxist has been adopted by people who he probably wouldn't have agreed with. Joseph Stalin, for example, he wouldn't have agreed with. And obviously, when you're dead, there's not much you can do about that, is there? So interpretations of his thought, which we shouldn't really associate with Marx at all, I don't think. And anybody who reads his work would certainly um, question the idea that some of these communist people think modern 20th century communist people they're not really reflecting Marx's actual ideas. Some communists people who call it communists are, but certainly people who have been big figures like Stalin and people, and to some degree Lenin as well, because Marx would not have agreed with all those ideas. You asked about today, the present, why it's important. Well, some of the things he's talking about, the capitalist mode of production, with the exploitation and the alienation that it involves, we can still see that he's got a point that there's a lot of exploitation in the capitalist system today, and what you might call alienation, which I'm sure we'll come on to later. At present, now he's worth reading. Even if you're going to disagree with him, he's got these ideas that you can sort of think, well, okay, I may not agree with Marx fully, but he's onto something there, and perhaps we can take that idea and use it and develop it and explore the implications of it and the possibilities coming from those ideas. So you don't have to read them and say, oh, I'm a wholehearted Marxist. You can say, well, he's got a point here. Maybe we can develop this or use it or explore its implications or its possibilities. And the more and more that you look at the world and the exploitation and so on in it, largely caused by capitalism, as we now call it, he's really got something to say, and I think he's really relevant for that reason.
Well, thank you very much for that very, very rich answer and for taking us, really giving us a nice contextualization of who Marx was and why he's important today. I was wondering if you could maybe give us a little brief biography of Marx's life. Now, it doesn't have to be exhaustive. It could just maybe just highlight the main events that are important for the viewers or what you think are important.
Okay, yeah. Born in 1818. Goes to university in Bonn at first, but his dad actually brings him away from there because he's doing too much time getting drunk and fighting and things like this. So he goes to Berlin, which is probably a good move on his part because that's where he meets the young Hegelians. As a young man at university, he's very influenced by Hegel himself, but he soon moves away from Hegel, more akin to the young Hegelians themselves than the old Hegelians. He starts to develop a set of ideas and a way of looking at the world, and with the way of looking at distance in a way that is very different than Hegel, which we'll come to. He's right. He's growing up at the time when he's born in Trier in the Rhineland. Now, this had been after the French Revolution under the control of Napoleon, for example, and well, before he's growing up, the Prussian state gets control again, and the Prussian state is becoming very reactionary. And although he's in Berlin, and he's writing some radical stuff in his dissertation, and in that environment, this which is not really receptive really to Marx's growing radical ideas, so he's advised to not to submit his dissertation at Berlin, but to submit it at Jena, which he does. His dissertation is still available in the collected works, and some of it's missing, but it's a good read. It's a good read. But anyway, he decides this by this time it's in the early 1840s, and he realizes that in Germany at least he's not going to get an academic position in the environments, in the political and intellectual environment in Germany, certainly Prussia, and so he concentrates for a while on his journalism, and he writes some really important journalistic articles, thinking about the way that what become known as capitalism, the capitalist mode of production, is really pushing a lot of people into poverty by exploiting them and seizing the resources of the poor, if you like. And one of his journalistic articles is about firewood gathering in the Rhineland, which had always been a source of fuel. You can gather fuel in the woods, that's whatever, it's come off trees, and you could use that. But the state then makes a law that no, that belongs to the landowner. So you couldn't do that. And he also writes another article on the vine growers in the Moselle region. They're getting a lot poorer price for their produce, and they go deeper into poverty there. So you can see where he's heading at the time. He's criticizing capitalism there and the influence it has on the poorer people, who he would begin to call the proletariat or working class as time goes by. He writes in 1844, he writes a set of works which are now known as the Paris manuscripts, or the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. And some of his really important ideas come through, such as alienation, which I think you're going to ask me about later. And also the species being, humanity as a species being. It's got its own characteristics, whatever kind of human you are, it's irrespective of so-called race and that kind of thing. If you're a human, you've got certain characteristics in the species being, and it's largely you're a producing being, you're a collective being. You can survive much better in a collective than in an individual. Very, very few of us live like Robinson Crusoe did on his island. The only reason that's an interesting story is because it's unusual. If you wrote about this guy who lived on an island on his own, well, it wouldn't be really interesting if it wasn't unusual. Because we're not that kind of person. We're collective. We live and we produce. Which we'll come back to, I think. Anyway, there's a lot more in economic and philosophical manuscripts. They're not actually published until after Marx's lifetime, but there's some really interesting stuff in there. He goes through the Holy Family, and it's based on a critique of Bauer, one of the, but it's doing other things as well. It introduces his materialist conception of history in a form. But the German ideology, again, he abandons it, really. He doesn't publish it. He leaves it to the mice, as he once said, to gnaw at it. That's published after his lifetime as well. Also, an important short document he writes in 1845 is Thesis on Feuerbach, which there's a lot in there, but the most famous phrase is from the 11th thesis, and he says the philosophers have only interpreted history in the different ways. The point is to change it, basically. Lauren will say he abandons philosophy, and he doesn't. He's saying it's have only interpreted. He's not saying that it's got to be abandoned. Yes, he's not abandoning philosophy altogether, but it says also you can add the point that the point is to change it, and he's getting his interests and moving away from philosophy into economics, politics, and also an action to do something about this. It's okay to write about things in philosophical ways, but actually what we're going to do is change this world. That he's begun to remember about the articles about the wood gatherers and the Moselle wine growers. These ideas about the exploitation have grown in his mind. He says now he's sure that the real point, the main and most important point, is now to do something about it and change the world. The German ideology, as I was talking about, which he introduces the materialist conception of history, and Douglas Burnham and I, in the First Marx, we include this in his early ideas. Now, other people have disagreed with us on this, and were disagreeing with us before we wrote it, if you like. They say that that's the point where he goes into the new Marx, the older Marx. Thinkers For example, Althusser, which I know you're interested in Althusser, he certainly thinks there's a divide there between the old young Marx and the old Marx. And I think he'd put the German ideology, I think he'd put that in the mature Marx, if you like, after the break. But Douglas and I said, well, it's actually transitional work. This is. It's still got a lot of the old philosophical discussion in there, but it's also got the new economic, materialist. Well, materialism within the philosophical, but the economic and political and action element of Marx's work. So we say it's like a transitional, and so you can sort of include some of the ideas in there with First Marx, as we call it. And there's also ideas that would develop in Marx's later work. So we say it's transitional. We get now to the late 1840s and the Communist Manifesto, of course. Marx, he wants to change the world, and he becomes involved in the communist movement. He and Engels form the Communist Correspondence Committee, and it's based in Belgium, but it's got branches all over the Europe, largely in London. But also at the same time is developing Communist League. It had been called the League of the Just, but it became the Communist League. And Engels and Marx decide that, well, their committee and the League sort of are coming together on it, and they sort of merge the two. Engels and Marx are asked to write this manifesto, if you like. Bearing in mind, 1848, this is a time of growing radicalism, disillusionment in existing society, and radicalism to changes in Europe. Engels writes two drafts of what would become the Communist Manifesto. They're very influential on Marx. A lot of the ideas in the Communist Manifesto you can see are in these two drafts, which were later published themselves, actually. But Marx actually gets these drafts of Engels, and he writes them in his own style. He writes it up in his own style, and Marx can be a lot more dramatic. He can write a political work. Some would disagree on me on this, but in a lot more exciting way than Engels, who was perhaps rather dry, if you like. They were very important, but not as sort of a bit dry. They're not the exciting sort of dramatic way that Marx can do so. So he produces this version of their jointly developing work, and very quickly, actually, in 1848, just as the European revolutions are breaking out. So it becomes, part of the literature of the time. The revolutionary movement is soon, defeated really by the existing forces, and the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels, for a while, they began to say, "Well, it's still relevant. We can still use this." But anyway, they as time goes on, they sort of don't pay much attention to it for quite a while. Later on, it's reintroduced because people again have said, "Oh, just a second, look at this old manifesto. This is really worth something. This is really worth reintroducing." From this time on, he's beginning to think about what the work that he would later in 1867 publish in the first edition of Capital, and this includes the contribution to the critique of political economy in 1859, that's published in 1859. Now, there's an important preface in there. There's been the Communist Manifesto is full of ideas that he would later develop in some of his later work. For example, in the preface, it's a very short preface, but it's a really important thing there where he talks about the productive forces of the world, they developing things like technology, ways of working, science, and so on, are contributing to the productive forces. Now, as productive forces become too advanced for the old way of exploiting the people, for example, feudalism and so on, something else takes over, and it's capitalism takes over, which is utilizing these productive forces It's because it's leaving feudalism behind. So the capitalism is utilizing these productive forces, and and he doesn't call it capitalism at this time, but it's the capitalist mode of production, as he calls it. And he talks about the mode of production. Now, a mode of production involves class relations, and you've got the dominant class and the dominated classes or class. The productive forces are being utilized by this new mode of production, and they're both pushing us forward, each other forward. The mode of production and the productive forces are pushing each other forward, and that's an important part of his work, which in Capital. In the meantime, he's also writing about other things. For example, in 1851 too, he writes about French politics, about the way that Louis Napoleon became the emperor by taking advantage of divisions within the capitalist class and the weakness of the class, which is the peasantry. That's an interesting read. That's the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And also in France, 1871, he talks about the Paris Commune and the way that that was defeated. Again, he says that some of the ideas that were being developed about how to run society, and not just the ideas, the ways, the actual physical ways of producing a system for a new kind of socialism. It wasn't exactly socialism in itself, but it could be useful to the development of socialism, these ways of organizing. Then it produced Capital. Capital is 1867, the first edition. It's really four volumes. Only the first one was published in his own lifetime. There's Capital 1 and Capital 2 and 3. Now, Capital 2 and 3, Engels edits what Marx has left unfinished and publishes them in Engels' own time. Also, there's the fourth, what was intended as the fourth volume is published not as one of the volumes of capitalism. It's called Theories of Surplus Value. And he also becomes, remember, he's not just a thinker, he's not just a writer, he wants to get involved in the socialist movement or communist movement. And he's involved in the first international movement, the International Working Men's Association, and he's a leading figure in this. There are big divisions in the international, including division between Marxist followers, or followers is the wrong word, probably Marx's his group, and the anarchists, under Bakunin and people like that. Marx arranges for the international to go over to America, to be run from America out of the way of the anarchists, if you like, and it collapses in 1876. Anyway, for the rest of his life, Marx always interested in, not just writing but agitating and organizing the movements, along with Engels. And Marx dies in 1883, and Engels takes on from that forward, from that point onwards.
What an absolute life.
Yeah.
You gave us a really, really great biography, actually. And you'd mentioned a lot of, the Jung Hegeliana, and you mentioned Hegel. So now we're here. The next question, what do you think, who do you think are Marx's philosophical and maybe political influences on his writing career?
Well, let's start with the Young Hegelian, shall we? I sort of include Feuerbach in that. I think some people would say he was related to them, but not part of them. I think he could say he's involved in the movement, I would think. Feuerbach's certainly important, and he's influential on Marx in a way that I'll mention in a moment. But Marx is a lot of the people who influence Marx reflects on them critically. Critical theory. And he's never a disciple, if you like, of any of the influences. They're influential, but he thinks critically about them. Ones he's really impressed by in the Young Hegelian movement are Gans, people like Gans and Hess. They're really important. There's people also in the Hegelian movement. There's people like Strauss. He's very critical of Bauer. but at first he's influential, but Marx becomes very critical of Bauer. Um, Hess is an interesting one because he's an early socialist as well as being a young Hegelian, and so and Gans he's particularly like Gans actually, and he seems to be influenced by Gans quite a lot. Um, so he's also influenced by some of the early French socialists, but again critically. You can see this in the Manifesto and other works. He's critical of from the French early socialists. As I said at the beginning, Marx is actually, presents a theoretical methodological framework for talking about socialism, about or communism, but he says, well, they've got the early French socialists have got something to say, actually. He and Engels agree on that. But he's very, in a critical way, their ideas need changing or developing in certain ways. And there's also the English political economists and people like James Mill, John Stuart Mill's dad, of course, and Ricardo. And Ricardo in particular talks about the theory of value, but Marx disagrees with Ricardo on value in that he's just talking about Ricardo. He gets nowhere really because he's just talking about value. You get value from producing something. That's the value. You get the value from that. But Marx says, oh no, you've got to look at what's happening in the environment, what's environment. What kind of society are we getting, and that influences what value is. And he comes up with Marx comes up with important idea of surplus value, which is the idea that you've got use value, but the capitalist who the worker works for, they pay the worker a basic minimum, basically, and then they take off all the profits, and which becomes surplus value, and that becomes capital. They can use that. Again, he's drawing on these economists, but critically so, and the French socialists and the young Hegelians. So they are big influences. Other influences, I mean, Hess is important. Again, he doesn't take his work wholesale. He works on it. It's critical. Engels, of course, you can't sort of get away from the fact that Engels and Marx influenced one another. They certainly did. You can see when I was talking about the Manifesto, they sort of influenced each other on that, and throughout their lives they influenced each other, Marx and Engels. So Engels is famous for getting the skint Marx some money, when Marx has got no money of his own, but he's a lot more than that. He works with Marx on the theory and the agitation, the organisation. So they're two central figures. There are other influences. I mean, the idea that from each according to his ability to each according to his needs is what you're getting through communism. Marx got that statement from Leo Blanc, but he used it in a very different way than Blanc did. So there's various influences you can think of, but on Marx. So hope that's okay for you, Chris.
Question is maybe directed towards this part of your scholarship. So what kind of philosophy does Marx have in light of the thesis on Feuerbach, and how do you think Feuerbach's influences Marx's reading of Hegel? And how do you see this reading, how do you see his historical materialism evolve out of this relationship with Feuerbach?
Okay. For one thing, Feuerbach's a materialist, isn't he? And he criticizes Hegel for his idealism. And Feuerbach, of course, says that we project what we think of as the ideal human, if you like, on this thing we call this being we call God. And whether one believes in God or not, he's saying that what human is portraying a God in a way that really he's invented this notion of God is whether there is an actual God, this notion of God is being invented by humans in order to sort of cover up really the bad parts of humanity that can be. Now, Marx says, well, we can overcome these bad parts of humanity and what we've got to realize is that Feuerbach's getting nowhere against its static idea, a static materialism. Now, Marx says, well, you are important, but what's important is that they are being driven by what's happening in material life. So you've got to look at what's happening on the ground materially, and that drives the ideas. So, for example, we are living in a society dominated by capitalism, and a lot of our ideas, whether we know it ourselves, whether we like it ourselves, and whether we know it ourselves, are being influenced by our environment, which is dominated by capitalism. And so he says that it's a materialism that's driving forward whereas Hegel, for example, he said there's a set of ideas that are evolving dialectically, eventually moving towards the absolute idea. Marx would say, well, that's losing sight of the fact that these ideas are based in material life. And as material life evolves, the ideas do too. So he's a materialist, but he moves on from Feuerbach's static materialism, if you like, and he moves back, and he's not sort of the basic materialist who's just saying material is everything, ideas are nothing. But he's saying, well, that the ideas follow the material life that humans are going through. At one point, he says, I think in the post phase or afterward, he says, "Well, the trouble with Hegel," he says, he's got everything standing on its head because he's got the ideas dominating, the development of history." Marx says, "Well, no, you've got to turn him the right way up. He's on his head, and you've got to turn him the right way up." A quite famous statement, I think. So that's how he's moving away further and further from Hegel. And Feuerbach's helping that with his materialism, but Marx says, let's look critically at Feuerbach. He's not really getting anywhere there. It's static. You've got to think about how things move forward, and actually how we can get away from this problem, rejecting what we see as our good points on this imagination of God, if you like. Hope that helps.
No, that did help. That did help a lot, actually. And you're really your answers are clear and they're concise and they're really directing us to how these changes and these shifts happen within Marx's thought. So thank you very much for all of this. The next question again takes from your book with Douglas, and because it did have a profound effect on me. So I was wondering and I think it also, I think this next question will also help those viewers that are not well read with Marx. So the concepts of production, alienation, exploitation, change, and emancipation play a central role, I guess, for the early humanist Marx or the early young Marx. How do you view these concepts, and do you think you could define them for all of us?
Yeah, I'll try to do that quickly. They're related. We organised the book on a series of concepts rather than sort of chronologically or anything like that. We decided the best way to do was focus on these concepts that are features of what we call the First Marx. The first one, production. The species being humanity is a species we produce, and that's not just producing things, products. We also produce our way of life and the world around us. We produce the world around us. If you looked at the world, we've changed the world in a lot of ways. And So there's the products we make, the world around it, but also ourselves. We produce ourselves. We produce what humans are becoming as the time goes on. We produce ourselves as well. So we're self-producing as well, I think. So and that's what we're about, producing. I think alienation was the next one, I think, isn't it? Um, this you find in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, or the Paris manuscripts, because he wrote them there, as they're sometimes called. There are four types of alienation, which differ from the sort of Hegelian forms of alienation. This is based on actual material life. We produce things, but under capitalism, the things are taken away from us, and the people who dominate us exploit us, which comes to the exploitation in a minute, and we just get paid a low wage for producing these things, and we become alienated from the thing. It's not like our thing that we've produced. We might have only produced a bit of it in a production line or something, but even if we produce the whole thing, we're alienated from it because it's taken away, and it's not seen as our thing that we produced. We also produced a second type of alienation, which leads to we're alienated from the activity of producing this. The activity, it's not seen as us. We're not seen as this producing being. We're alienated from the activity. It's just seen as something we produced and it's sold and we're paid a wage for. Because we're producing beings and the species being, we come to the third form of alienation, which is the alienation from the species being, because we're alienating from ourselves, what we're all about. Fourthly, because of this, we're alienated from our fellow human beings. We will get a better society if we can cooperate, but seen as individualists, we're alienated from our fellow human beings. This leads us to exploitation. Marx believes in there's always been exploitation in all the previous modes of production, the feudalism, capitalism, and the ones before feudalism. There was always exploitation there. So there's that form of exploitation. There's exploitation which is particular to the capitalist system. There's exploitation, which is linked to alienation, which links back a bit in some ways to Hegel. But also, what's very important that we say in the book, we say there's exploitation. It's systemic. It's systemic, and it comes from the system itself. Because of the capitalist system, it exploits in a systematic kind of way. So that's the exploitation. I hope I'm not being too brief on this, but moving on to change. Well, that's linked to the dialectic. We can change. It also links back to that 11th thesis of Feuerbach, philosophers have only interpreted the world in different ways. The point is to change it. We can change it, and you do that by moving forward in history. And you can do that. You get the big changes when you move away from a different mode of production. So a big change came from feudalism to capitalism by utilizing productive forces. Eventually, the productive forces will become outdated of capitalism because we can produce so much more. Capitalism has to hold the productive forces back in order to keep making profit and to keep exploiting us. We know at some point we say, just a second, we're being exploited. We can use these productive forces to produce so much more and so much a better life for all humans. So therefore, Marx thinks that the revolution will sort of develop there towards a communism. So there's the change in that way. It's linked to the dialectic. Emancipation, which is the last one. Even in the Young Marx, he talks a lot about, makes some important points about emancipation, and he says there's some different kinds of emancipation. There's individual emancipation, but also there's emancipation of humanity, and the people who can do that are the proletariat, because they can move the organization and agitation forward in a way that will develop the productive forces forward. and as the proletariat can overcome, can help lead to the emancipation of themselves and for the rest of humanity by driving this forward. So those are the ones, the main concepts we concentrate on there, Chris.
Yeah, and I think the book, as well as right now, does a very great does a great job of kind of unpacking and unraveling this for both the reader and you, what you did right now for the viewer. Because you've written on the Communist Manifesto,
Mm.
I'm going to ask you this question, which was, what do you think, in your opinion, was Marx and Engels' vision for communism in the manifesto, or socialism?
Yeah, he doesn't say a lot about the final communist goal in the manifesto, but he does talk about developments that should take place when after the revolution has sort of overthrown capitalism. That leads to what Marx says is at that point we've won the battle of democracy, which causes some confusion. I think what Marx is saying is that we've become well, what he does say, that we've taken we've removed the ruling class from its ruling position, and we're taking this ruling, if you like, now for ourselves, the proletariat and its allies. They will they're in control of what we can do in society. So we've won the battle of democracy. We're in control now. And he introduces a list of things that we need to do immediately after the revolution. And for example, that abolition of private property in agriculture. I'll just mention a few of them: centralisation of industry and centralisation of credit. Things like education of children and getting rid of this exploitative child labour. And there's a list. You'll find them easily in the manifesto. This is the first point. Now, but that will develop. Eventually, we can move on to a higher stage of communism, which will be, as Marx put it, where the free development of each. Marx says this in the manifesto. The free development of each can lead to the free development of us all. So he's interested in freedom. This is linked to emancipation. This is where emancipation comes from the early work into the later work too, because the free development of each will become the condition for the free development of all. You can see that as a form of emancipation, it is really. The emancipation of all is the free development of all. You can see as emancipation, but he doesn't say much else about communism, and he doesn't say a lot about communism, the higher stage of communism in much of it. He says quite a bit of it. He says a bit about it in the German ideology, abolition of private property, for example, and a new way of thinking where we can think about, we not think about trying to exploit other people, think about what's best for us all. He also later on in Critique of the Gotha program, or Gotha program, however you want to pronounce it, and some of the socialists in Germany in the 1870s produced a Gotha program about the development of socialism, and Marx is quite critical of, for various reasons, which I won't go into, of what his rival socialists are saying. But more relevant to what I'm saying now is that he again talks about two stages of communism. There's this, one where we introduce a socialist phase. We'll get what we've earned, and what we've worked we'll earn, except for what we'll pay towards the common running of society. So we'll of course recognise, and we'll be sensible enough to think, yeah, we can't keep everything. We've got to pay taxes, for example. He doesn't say that, but that's what it amounts to. You'll pay some taxes for the good running of society as a whole. Later, he said, well, the later stage of communism, the fourth stage, is where from each according to ability to each according to need, which is what you mentioned earlier. But he doesn't say a lot in any of his work about the higher stage, and I think what he's more concerned to say, well, this is the problem with capitalism, and this is how we can try to get out of it, than what we do in the future. I think he's he gives some outlines of it, but I think he leaves that to people who are on the ground afterwards to work that out.
Thank you so much for that. Um, I was interested in how you would answer this question, and I think you did a great job. And yeah, I think I like this idea of leaving it open for others. But
Mm.
then do you think people like Trotsky and Lenin captured Marx's ideas properly, or
Um, so I mean, even before Lenin and Trotsky, you've got people like Kautsky who made a very sort of saying, well, you've got to just let capitalism work itself out. You'll be organizing, and then there'll be a final push, and you'll uh, uh, push capitalism out of the way when it's weakened so much. Um, whether how much Marx would agree with some, but not all of that. Trotsky and Lenin, as you mentioned, again, he would agree with some of the things they think. What he would not wholly agree with, I think, is the society that he tried to introduce communism into, um, which was a very backward Russian society. Capitalism itself was really in an undeveloped stage there. Marx was thinking really that capitalism would move forward in the advanced capitalist countries, such as Great Britain, for example, the United Kingdom. He seems to be anticipating Trotsky's idea of the permanent revolution, where you can start the revolution in the economically backward countries. But I think he would say probably that Lenin and Trotsky pushed this too far, and they were a bit impatient, maybe even, and this is what leads to a growing sort of, well, it leads to the Civil War, for example, which they can't help because the capitalist countries invade and try to push the communists back, but they win the Civil War, but at what cost? And maybe Marx may have said, well, you may be moving too quickly here. What he certainly, and it's also led to this Stalinist dictatorship. Sort of the roots of it are beginning in Lenin. In Lenin, a lot of people would not like me for saying that, but I think that a lot of it, the roots of this are starting with Lenin. But um, I think these are getting out of Lenin's control. I think and Stalin comes along and goes, "Oh, I can take control of this," and he does, and that's completely goes against, I think, the Marxist ideas.
thank you so much. A lot of these ideas are gaining a little more traction right now, um, especially online. So this is why I wanted to do this
Hmm.
episode with yourself, who's worked so long on all of these concepts and ideas, and you're really bringing to light. You're kind of giving us you're bringing back to life Marx here
No, thank you.
in this hour that we've been discussing and talking. And um, the next question is probably a little controversial because I don't really know where you fit in on the spectrum. I know there's always this idea that there's two Marx, there's a younger Marx and a later Marx.
Mm.
Um, but so I guess my question is, maybe we don't have to go that route, but what makes Marx's ideas in Capital so different from his maybe earlier work? Or do you see a unitary line, or do you see a difference?
And I don't see a unitary line. First, in the first Marx, we decided that whatever the merits or whatever of the later work, what we were trying to say is that Marx, in the earlier works, he's putting forward a solid political philosophy, and that he intended at some point of actually put this in a full work, if you like, in either a full work or a set of smaller works. He was going, but he loses interest. To be honest, he loses interest in the philosophical side. He's more concerned in the later work, science, if you like, economic and social science, rather than a philosophy. And you can see when you read the later works, there's the language, the words he uses into this sort of social scientific writing, um, and I think that is a big difference there. Will, I think, if we're honest with ourselves, um, we're influenced by different ideas, different things that are happening, different things that are happening in the world. Um, and sometimes if I think back to what I was thinking 10 years ago, maybe I would disagree with some of the things, not, not wholeheartedly, but I think my ideas sort of change in some ways over time. And I think a lot of people's do. So I don't think there's a dividing line there between them. I think the ideas are gradually developing. And I don't think he actually abandons all the early ideas. But what he abandons, if you like, is this philosophical approach and moves to a more social scientific approach.
All right. No, I liked what you have presented, and I agree with it as well too. And I want to thank you for being here and for helping us navigate through this very rich thinker, from his more philosophical side into his more political and economic side. So thank you so much, Dr. Lamb, for being a part of the series and for also, really, I can see the passion in your eyes and in your face when you're speaking about Marx. So
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for having me, Chris. That's been great. I really enjoyed it.
Me as well, too. Have a good one.